The Argo sailed through the silent emptiness of space, its sleek, silver hull glinting under the distant stars. The mission was clear: to explore an uncharted planet far from Earth, a world thought to be a Class 14 Deathworld, one of the most dangerous types of planets known to humanity. The crew had prepared for weeks, their hearts filled with both excitement and fear. They were about to land on a world that could destroy them in an instant. "Approaching the planet in 10 minutes, Captain." The calm voice of Lena, the ship's navigator, broke the tense silence in the cockpit. Captain Elena Summers stood in front of the massive view screen, watching as the planet slowly came into view. It was surrounded by swirling clouds, like an angry storm was always raging on its surface. The planet's dark, rocky surface was barely visible through the thick atmosphere, and the ship's sensors confirmed it was as dangerous as predicted. The planet's classification as a Class 14 Deathworld was no mistake. It was a place where only the toughest, most prepared explorers survived. "Prepare for descent, everyone," Elena ordered. Her voice was calm, but there was no hiding the weight of the situation. If anything went wrong, it could be their last mission. As the Argo broke through the storm clouds and began descending, the ship's hull shook violently, the pressure of the planet's atmosphere pressing in. The air outside was turbulent, filled with violent winds and unrelenting lightning strikes. Lena kept her focus on the controls, her fingers working quickly as the ship adjusted its course. "Atmospheric pressure is stabilizing, Captain, but we're still looking at heavy winds and electrical interference." Lena's voice crackled through the intercom. "Understood. Proceed with caution," Elena replied. The crew members sat in silence as the ship continued its descent. Outside, the sky was dark, filled with black storm clouds swirling like something alive. The lightning flashes were bright enough to light up the entire sky, and the thunder shook the Argo with every strike. Finally, the ship touched down on the surface. The landing gear sank slightly into the soft ground, the ship creaking with the force of the planet's gravity. The crew let out a collective breath. They were on the surface, but their mission had only just begun. The hatch opened, and Elena led the crew outside. The first thing they noticed was the air. It wasn't like the deadly atmosphere they had been prepared for. In fact, it was almost comfortable. The wind blew gently, and the temperature was mild. The ground beneath their boots was soft and earthy, much like soil from Earth, not at all like the rocky, barren surface they had expected. "This doesn't look like a death world," Alex, the ship's lead scientist, said, his voice filled with confusion. He checked the data on his tablet again, but the readings didn't match what he had prepared for. Elena scanned the landscape. The area around them was covered in lush, green vegetation. There were trees tall and thick, with leaves that shimmered in strange colors, deep blues, purples, and golds. The ground was dotted with small, vibrant flowers, and the distant sound of running water could be heard. The landscape seemed peaceful, almost serene. "Are we sure this is the right planet?" Elena asked, narrowing her eyes as she took a cautious step forward. "I expected a planet full of hostile creatures and unbreathable air. Not this." Alex's confusion deepened. "The atmosphere readings are stable, Captain. The oxygen levels are almost identical to Earth's. But something's wrong. The composition of the air doesn't match what we were expecting from a Class 14 Deathworld." Elena didn't like the sound of that. Something was off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone on this planet. There was something about it, an unsettling sense of familiarity that she couldn't explain. As the team moved deeper into the lush forest, the trees gave way to something more unexpected, a massive ancient structure rising from the ground. It looked like a city, but it was half buried under the thick roots of the trees, like it had been there for centuries. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the stone. It looked like no civilization they had ever seen, yet there was something familiar about it, something that made Elena's stomach twist. "What is this place?" Elena murmured. She couldn't take her eyes off the symbols. They were human. At least they looked like the symbols used by humanity in the early days of space exploration. Alex stepped closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Captain, these symbols, they're not alien. They're human." Alina's heart skipped a beat. Human. That was impossible. This planet was thousands of light years away from Earth. There was no way it could be linked to their home. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling the weight of the discovery sinking in. Alina motioned for them to keep moving, but her mind was racing. Could this really be Earth? She had always believed that humanity's home was lost to time, a distant memory buried deep in history. But now, standing in front of these ruins, she couldn't shake the thought that this was no ordinary Deathworld. As they moved deeper into the ruins, a low hum vibrated through the ground. It was faint at first, but the sound grew louder and more intense. The walls of the ruined city began to pulse with a strange energy. Alina's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she pushed forward, unable to tear her eyes away from the mysteries unfolding before her. "Everyone, get back to the ship. Something's not right." Alina's voice was firm, but her words trembled slightly. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a growing sense of dread. But before they could react, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The ruins around them began to shake, and the strange hum grew louder, as though the planet itself was waking up. The crew had only one thought racing through their minds. What had they discovered? Suddenly, the realization hit them all. This was no ordinary Deathworld. It wasn't an alien planet at all. It was Earth. The ground trembled beneath their feet as Alina's crew stood frozen, staring at the ruins that once seemed so distant, so alien. The strange hum had stopped, but the air felt charged, as if the planet itself was alive and watching them. Alina's heart raced, her mind struggling to piece together the impossible discovery they had just made. Earth. How could this be Earth? She glanced at Alex, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. His tablet showed nothing but static. The data was all wrong, and yet the symbols on the walls, those familiar symbols, told a story that couldn't be ignored. "Captain, this isn't possible." Alex's voice was barely a whisper, as if he was speaking to himself. "I checked the readings again. These ruins, they have human origins." He shook his head, his fingers trembling over the device, trying to make sense of the impossible. Alina stepped closer to the stone walls, running her fingers over the symbols. They were older than anything she'd seen before, but the shape, the pattern, it was unmistakably human. The early explorers, the ones who had ventured into space before the Great Wars, had used these symbols to mark their territory. But how could they have made it this far? And why? What happened to Earth that it would be forgotten, left behind like a faded dream? "We need to keep moving." Alina's voice was firm, but the fear in her chest was growing with each passing second. She wasn't sure whether it was the planet, the ruins, or the unsettling silence that made her uneasy. There was something here, something hidden beneath the surface, something waiting. She could feel it. The crew reluctantly followed her, each of them glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The forest around them had become eerily still, the air thick with an unnatural quiet that felt suffocating. The usual sounds of wildlife, chirps, rustling, buzzing, were absent. All they could hear was their own breathing and the occasional crackle of static from their communication equipment. As they moved deeper into the ruins, the temperature dropped. The once warm breeze turned cold, and the ground beneath them grew harder, like something was shifting just beneath the surface. Alina's eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Not even the wind seemed to dare disturb the air around them. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching. Then, out of nowhere, a sound cut through the silence. A distant thud, like a door opening far away. Alina's heart skipped. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. The crew froze, their eyes wide. "What was that?" Lena whispered, clutching her equipment tightly. Lena didn't answer. Her instincts screamed that they weren't alone. Something was out there, something big, and it was watching them. Her grip tightened on her weapon as they slowly crept forward, each step filled with growing tension. The thud had come from deeper within the ruins. She motioned for the crew to follow, though she didn't know what they were walking into. Whatever it was, they had to be ready. The walls of the ancient city seemed to close in around them, and the hum began again, so faint at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with every step. Then they reached it, the heart of the ruins. In the center of the forgotten city, there stood a massive structure, taller than anything they had seen so far. It was not a building, but something else, something alive. The structure shimmered with an unnatural glow, its surface shifting and changing, as if it was breathing. It resembled a gigantic crystalline tree, its roots spreading deep into the ground, but its leaves were made of something far more alien, something that defied the laws of nature. The very air around it seemed to vibrate with energy, as if the structure itself was alive, feeding off the energy of the planet. "What is that?" Alex asked, his voice filled with awe and terror. Lena could hardly speak. She stepped forward, drawn by a force she couldn't explain, her eyes locked on the structure. "We need to get closer," she said, almost to herself. But even as she spoke, her mind was screaming to turn back. This was too much. They had no idea what they were dealing with. What if this wasn't just a discovery? What if this was a warning? The team moved closer, and the closer they got, the stronger the hum became. It was deafening now, shaking their bones, vibrating in the air. And as they stepped closer, something happened. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, sending a shockwave through the air. Lena fell to her knees, her heart racing as the rumbling intensified. The structure before them pulsed brightly, like a heartbeat, and then everything stopped. The hum, the tremors, the strange feeling in the air, it all fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, they thought it was over. But then, from deep within the structure, a low, mechanical voice echoed out, speaking in a language none of them could understand. It was deep, resonant, and ancient, as though the planet itself was speaking to them. Lena felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. The air felt thick, suffocating. Something was waking up, something old, something powerful, and it was not happy about their presence. "Get back to the ship," Lena shouted, her voice breaking through the panic that was beginning to rise in her chest. But before they could move, the structure began to glow brighter. The ground cracked open even further, and from the depths of the ruins, something began to rise, a shape massive and moving. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the crew backed away slowly, every instinct telling them to run. They had come looking for answers, but now they realized the truth. This planet was not just a forgotten world. It was something else entirely. And whatever lay hidden beneath its surface was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The crew moved cautiously back toward the Argo, but the atmosphere had shifted. The eerie quiet that had gripped the planet moments before seemed to hang even heavier in the air. The oppressive silence surrounded them like a thick fog, and every step they took felt like it echoed across the empty world. Lena's instincts screamed at her to hurry, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them from the depths of the ruins. "Hurry, everyone." Lena's voice was sharp, the urgency in her tone cutting through the quiet. Her eyes kept darting over her shoulder, scanning the darkening horizon for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Not a sound, not a rustle, just the heavy silence. As they neared the ship, the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet once more. The earth trembled, though it was softer this time, like a distant pulse. The air was still warm, but Lena could feel the temperature beginning to drop, a chill creeping into the back of her neck as the shadow of the ruins stretched long across the landscape. The strange, crystalline structure they had found was now obscured in the distance, its pulsating light dimming as if retreating back into the ground, like some creature pulling away from the light. "We need to get out of here." Alex's voice trembled as he hurried toward the ship, his eyes wide with panic. "Whatever that thing is, it's not something we can handle." Elena didn't need any convincing. She quickened her pace, her boots pounding against the soft earth as she reached the ship's open hatch. The crew was already inside, but Elena paused for a moment, looking back at the distant ruins one last time. The hum from earlier had returned, faint but unmistakable. It reverberated through the ground, making the air feel thick, alive. Elena's breath hitched. What were they dealing with? She couldn't allow herself to question too much, though. They needed to leave. "Captain, get inside." Lena's voice snapped her out of her thoughts, the urgency growing with every passing second. Elena nodded and entered the ship. The hatch sealed behind her with a low thud. Inside, the crew was already securing their gear, checking systems, and preparing for liftoff. There was a sense of tension in the air, a nervous energy that spread across the crew like wildfire. They all knew something was off. Something ancient had awakened beneath their feet, something that had been dormant for who knew how long. The silence was deafening as everyone strapped into their seats, each person lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what they had just discovered. Elena strapped herself into the captain's chair, her hands gripping the controls. She didn't speak, but her mind was racing. Earth. It had to be. The ruins, the symbols, the familiar landscape. But how? And why had it been hidden for so long? "Captain, we're ready for takeoff." Lena's voice broke through the silence. "Initiate launch," Elena replied quietly. The words felt like a command, but they also felt empty. She wasn't sure if she was escaping from a secret they weren't meant to know, or running from something far worse than they had anticipated. The ship slowly lifted off the ground, the engines humming to life as the Argo ascended into the sky. They broke through the dense clouds and emerged into the vast emptiness of space, leaving the planet behind. But even as the ship gained altitude, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She stared out the viewport, watching as the planet grew smaller and smaller in the distance. A soft beep came from the control panel. Alex's voice followed, sounding more troubled than usual. "Captain, you need to see this." Elena glanced at him, then turned her attention to the screen. The readings were no longer clear. They were distorted, like static, like something was blocking the signal. "What's going on?" Elena asked, her heart racing again. She didn't like the look on Alex's face. He wasn't the type to panic, but he was now staring at the display as though he had seen a ghost. "I don't know, Captain, but the planet is. It's changing. The signals are being scrambled. It's like it's reacting to us." His voice was strained. He leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the data, but it was all garbled. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The hum they had heard earlier wasn't just a sound. It wasn't just the planet vibrating. It was something active, something powerful, and it was aware of them. "What do you mean reacting?" Lena asked, her voice tense. "I mean, it's like it's fighting back." Alex finally looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it. The planet is adapting. It's changing to try and communicate with us." Elena shook her head. This couldn't be happening. They had just discovered Earth, or what they thought was Earth, sitting out there, hidden in the dark reaches of space, and now it seemed to be fighting them off. But what kind of planet could do that? What kind of power was at work here? "We need to get out of here. Now." Elena's voice was firm, but her gut told her they were already too late. Whatever this planet was, it wasn't going to let them leave that easily. But before she could give the order to jump to warp speed, the ship shook violently. The lights flickered, and the Argo tilted to the side. Elena's hands gripped the controls tightly, trying to keep the ship steady. There was no time to waste. "Brace for impact," she shouted. The Argo was thrown off course. A wave of energy rippled through the ship, and the entire vessel seemed to groan, as though the planet was reaching out to pull them back. The crew was thrown into chaos as the ship spun wildly through space. Alina's vision blurred, but she fought to stay conscious, her hands working furiously to regain control. Somewhere deep within the ship, a low, ominous growl echoed. The chaos inside the Argo continued as the ship spiraled through space, tossed around by the mysterious force emanating from the planet. Alina struggled to keep her hands steady on the controls, her mind racing as the violent tremors shook the vessel. She could hear the alarm blaring, lights flickering, and crew members shouting, but her focus was on one thing: getting them out of here. "Captain, the systems are failing." Lena's voice cracked through the panic. "The ship is taking damage. Nothing's responding." Alina's heart skipped a beat. She had never been in a situation like this. They were too far from help, too far from anything. The Argo was their lifeline, and it was breaking apart under their hands. "What the hell is happening to us?" Alex shouted from the navigation console. "I can't stabilize the trajectory. The planet. It's like it's actively pulling us in. I can't break free." Alina's eyes darted to the viewport. Through the blurred haze of the ship's shaking hull, she saw it, the planet. But it wasn't the same as before. The atmosphere had changed, swirling in on itself like some cosmic vortex. The storm clouds were growing darker, more menacing, and the glowing structure they had discovered earlier flickered like a beacon, its pulse resonating through space itself. "This can't be real," Alex whispered, staring at the planet's surface. The readings were chaotic, distorted. It was as if the planet was alive and aware of them. Alina's mind raced. How is this possible? There was no known technology or force capable of manipulating space-time this way, of reaching into a ship's systems and disabling them at will. The planet shouldn't have that power. "Get us out of here now," Alina barked. She was losing her grip on the situation, but she couldn't let that show. Not now, not with her crew relying on her. Lina desperately began to reroute power to the engine, trying to override the planet's influence. But nothing worked. The Argo was trapped in a gravitational lock, pulled toward the surface like a moth to a flame. Alina felt the ship dip slightly, the pull growing stronger with each passing second. She gritted her teeth. There was no way they were going to make it out by conventional means. "If we don't get clear soon, we'll be stuck here forever," Alex said, his voice flat, almost numb. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. This planet, it's trying to keep us here." A sudden crackling sound came over the intercom. For a moment, Alina thought it was static. Then a low, rasping voice echoed throughout the ship. It wasn't human. It was something deep, ancient, and incomprehensible. "You should not have come." The voice was not in any language they knew. It wasn't even a traditional communication. It felt like the planet itself was speaking directly into their minds, bypassing language entirely. The crew froze. Alina's heart pounded in her chest. This was not just a planet. It was something more, something sentient. What is that?" Lina gasped, her eyes wide with terror. The ship jolted again, harder this time. The energy around them intensified, filling the cabin with a low hum that seemed to resonate deep in their bones. The voice continued, now more forceful, like a warning they couldn't ignore. "You are trespassers. Your presence disrupts the balance." Alina's hands tightened on the controls, her knuckles white. She couldn't understand what was happening. But the threat was clear. The planet wasn't just an object. It was alive, conscious, and angry. "This isn't just a planet, is it?" Alex said, his voice shaking. "It's a prison. A place where something powerful has been kept hidden. For centuries. And we've just disturbed it." Alina's mind raced. A prison? For what? What could be so dangerous that an entire planet was turned into a holding cell? The questions swirled in her mind, but the answers were slipping farther and farther away with every passing second. We have to get out of here now. Elena shouted again. She was losing control. The ship was no longer responding to her commands. The Argo was on a one-way path toward the planet's surface. Then, just as quickly as the force had started, it stopped. The Argo lurched forward, and then fell silent, as if the planet had released its grip. Elena blinked, her heart still racing in her chest. The shaking had ceased. The hum was gone. For a moment, everything was still. But that stillness was just as terrifying as the chaos had been. "What's happening now?" Lena asked, her voice shaky. She was staring at the control panel, her eyes wide with disbelief. Alex had been silent, his face a mix of shock and confusion. He looked at the readings, then back at Elena. "Captain, it's gone." Elena stared at the screen in front of her. The gravitational pull from the planet had vanished. The Argo was floating freely again, no longer in danger of crashing down. But the planet remained, distant and silent in the void of space. It was as if the power that had been keeping them there had disappeared, leaving them with only questions. But Elena wasn't fooled. She knew the planet wasn't finished with them. There was something waiting, something powerful, and it had just begun to show its true face. "We need to get back to Earth." Elena's voice was cold and firm, despite the fear clawing at the back of her mind. "We need to warn them. Whatever is on that planet, whatever it is, it's not going to stay hidden for much longer." The crew exchanged uneasy looks. They had come to explore, to discover the unknown. But what they had uncovered was far beyond anything they could have imagined. And now, the real threat was just beginning. As the Argo slowly turned and began its journey back into deep space, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the planet was still watching them, still waiting. Whatever it was hiding, it wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And they had only scratched the surface. The Argo drifted through the void of space, its engines humming softly as it gained distance from the planet. Elena sat silently in the captain's chair, her fingers lightly resting on the control panel. Her mind, however, was a storm of thoughts and fears. The planet, the prison, the force, had let them go. But that didn't mean it was finished with them. Elena knew this was only the beginning. Whatever was hidden there, whatever had been awakened, it wasn't going to let them leave without consequence. Alex was hunched over his console, still staring at the data readouts. His fingers moved over the touchpad, trying to make sense of the scrambled signals and distorted readings. The deeper they went, the less reliable their systems became. He'd never seen anything like it before. The planet had tampered with their communications, disabled their ship's functions, and even now, the data was inconsistent. "What's going on?" Elena finally asked, breaking the tense silence that had hung over the ship for the past several minutes. Alex looked up, his face drawn and tired. His normally confident demeanor had been replaced by something else, something darker. "Captain, I don't know how to explain this, but the planet isn't just reacting to us. It's predicting us." Elena frowned. "Predicting us? How is that even possible?" He nodded, tapping his console nervously. "Every time I try to gather data, it's like the planet already knows what I'm going to do. Every command I try to issue gets blocked or altered. It's like something is inside our systems, controlling our every move." Elena's heart sank. They weren't just dealing with a planet or an alien life form. It was as if this world was aware of them on a level they couldn't comprehend. And it was active. Alive. "But we got away. We're out of range." Lena's voice was shaky, her eyes darting around the room, clearly trying to convince herself. "It should be over, right? We can just go back to Earth. Warn them. Let them know what happened." "That's what I thought," Elena replied grimly. She turned her chair to face the viewport, staring out into the cold emptiness of space. The planet, now a distant speck, seemed so small from here, but Elena could feel it still. That energy, that pull, it lingered in her chest, and with it came a heavy, terrifying realization. We don't know what we're really dealing with, and we might have just unleashed something we can't stop. We'll figure it out." Alex's voice was more hopeful now, but Elena could hear the cracks in his tone. He was still shaking. "We need more information," Elena said, standing up and moving to the communications panel. She tapped in a few commands, trying to reach Earth's deep space relay station, but the signal wouldn't clear. Her stomach twisted in knots as the realization hit her. The planet's interference hadn't just been local, it had spread out across the entire region of space they'd just passed through. They were cut off. "We're not getting through, Captain." Lena's voice sounded tense as she looked at the communications panel with increasing frustration. "The interference is still blocking all long-range transmissions. We're isolated." The weight of isolation hung heavily on them. They had no way to contact Earth, no way to warn anyone. And the planet, whatever it was, had somehow tied itself into their ship's systems, keeping them from escaping. There was no telling what kind of damage it had done while they were still so close, and no telling what it might do next. Elena turned away from the panel and made her way to the viewport again, staring out at the stars. They were moving farther from the planet with every passing second, but she felt no relief. Something was wrong. The ship had been damaged, their communications severed, and the sense of being watched. It never left. Elena knew they weren't safe, not yet. As she stared out into the abyss, a low rumble shook the Argo. The ship tilted sharply to one side, throwing Elena off balance. She grabbed the nearest console to steady herself, but the ship continued to shake, this time more violently. "Captain." Alex's voice was sharp, a clear edge of panic in it. "There's something on our sensors. It's moving toward us." Elena's stomach churned. The ship's alert systems blared as a new signal began to pulse on their radar. The readings were erratic, impossible to decipher. It was as if something was closing in on them from the deep space ahead. She felt the ship lurch again, and this time it wasn't just a tremor. It was as if something was trying to pull them back. "Is it another ship?" Lena asked, her voice strained. "I don't know. It doesn't register like anything I've ever seen." Alex's fingers moved frantically across the control panel. "It's not human." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Something was following them. Something that wasn't from Earth. The ship shook again, even more violently than before, and Elena was thrown against the side of the command deck. The crew scrambled to stay on their feet as the lights flickered. Everything inside the ship felt like it was vibrating in sync with the pulse from the mysterious object, and the air was growing thick and electric. "Get us out of here," Elena yelled, struggling to rise from the floor. "Full throttle. Get us away from whatever that is." But as the crew scrambled to respond, the shaking stopped, abruptly. For a moment, there was only the sound of their heavy breathing, the echo of the ship's damaged hull groaning under the pressure. Then a voice came over the intercom. It wasn't from the crew. It was something else, something cold, ancient, and filled with power. "You cannot leave." The words were unmistakable. The voice was deep, almost mechanical, and yet human. The crew froze, the room falling into a tense silence. Elena felt the chill creep up her spine again, a wave of dread washing over her. She knew that voice. And now she understood. The planet wasn't just trying to keep them there. It was controlling something far worse. Something alive. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before the voice spoke again, its tone more commanding this time. "You have awakened me. And now you must face the consequences." Elena turned to her crew, her expression grim. They were no longer just explorers. They were prisoners on a ship trapped in an alien force field of unimaginable power. And it was clear, whatever they had unleashed on that planet was coming for them now. The Argo drifted in the silence of deep space, its hull still trembling slightly from the violent force that had shaken it moments earlier. The crew sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The planet, the voice, it all seemed impossible. But Elena knew they couldn't afford to dwell on disbelief. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was coming for them. The intercom clicked again, and the voice returned, cold and unfeeling. "You will not escape." Elena's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't even a threat. It was a promise. The voice, deep and mechanical, pulsed with power, almost like it was feeding off their fear. She stood up, moving toward the control panel. They couldn't wait any longer. They had to act fast. "Captain, we've got no options left." Alex's voice was ragged. He was staring at the screen in front of him, eyes wide with dread. "The systems, they're still glitching. It's like the planet has control of everything. The ship's power is fluctuating. The engines are barely responsive." Elena swallowed hard, turning to face her crew. They were all tense, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. But there was no time for fear now. "I'm going to try something." She moved to the navigation console, trying to override the damaged systems. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped the controls tightly. The voice seemed to grow louder, more forceful in her mind as she worked. "You cannot escape, Captain." Elena clenched her jaw. She could feel the voice reverberating in her chest, digging deeper into her mind. It was like it was everywhere, inside and outside the ship. She couldn't fight it. Not alone. "Lena, get to the back and check the auxiliary power systems," Elena ordered, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to reroute everything to the engines. We can't outrun this thing without full power." Lena nodded without a word and moved swiftly to the back of the ship, her face pale but determined. Elena knew that their best chance now was to use every ounce of power they had left to break free, even if it was just a small burst. As Lena disappeared into the back, Elena turned to Alex. "Can you track the source of the interference?" she asked. "I need to know where it's coming from." Alex nodded, his fingers flying over the console. "I think I can isolate it. Maybe." He frowned as the screen flickered. The data was unreadable again. He scowled and pressed a few more buttons, but the screen was static. It was as if whatever force was behind the interference had learned to anticipate their moves, cutting off their access just as quickly as they gained it. The voice returned, louder now, almost shaking the walls of the ship. "You will never leave this place. This is your prison. You are mine." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself. The voice was pushing them to the edge, trying to break their will, to make them doubt. But Elena couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Captain, I've got it." Alex's voice broke through the tension, filled with a glimmer of hope. He pointed to the screen. "It's coming from the planet. But it's not just coming from the surface." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" It's a signal." Alex's voice was filled with both awe and dread. "Not from the planet itself. There's something beneath it. A structure. An ancient underground complex. It's like the planet is acting as a transmitter. Whatever is inside that structure is controlling the interference. It's the source of the power." A chill ran down Elena's spine. They had barely scratched the surface of the planet's mystery. And now, it seemed the heart of the danger was buried deep beneath its surface. "If that's the source, then we need to destroy it." Elena's voice was cold, determined. "We can't let whatever is controlling us spread further. We need to stop it before it reaches Earth." But as she said it, she knew how impossible that sounded. Destroying it meant going back. It meant returning to the very place that had nearly killed them. They had barely escaped with their lives. Now, they had to face the heart of the beast. The voice spoke again, its tone mocking, almost amused. "You think you can stop me? I am not a force you can control, Captain. I am eternal." Elena felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some alien species or random anomaly. It was something older. Something ancient and powerful. She knew that she couldn't let it go unchecked. But what if they weren't strong enough? What if they didn't have the power to destroy it? What if it was already too late? Lena, how's the power? Alina asked, swallowing the growing unease in her chest. Lena's voice came back, tight with fear but filled with focus. I've got the secondary power systems online, Captain, but we're running out of time. Whatever it is, it's already starting to interfere again. The ship's systems are breaking down fast. Alina gritted her teeth, eyes flicking to the viewport again. The planet, now a distant blur, loomed in the distance. She could feel it, feel the pull. It wasn't finished with them. Prepare for a burn. Alina's voice rang out with quiet authority. She knew that they had only one chance. They had to return to the planet, to go deep below its surface and shut down whatever was causing this chaos. It was a suicide mission. They couldn't afford to fail. They wouldn't make it out alive if they did. Are you sure? Alex asked, his voice strained. We don't even know what we're up against down there. We're just guessing. Alina met his eyes, her gaze steely. We don't have a choice. We're running out of time. Alex, the planet knows we're coming, and it won't let us leave unless we stop it. With no other option, they set the ship's course, heading back toward the planet's surface. The voice in their head spoke again, but this time it sounded almost pleased.